So I think we can get started. If you'd like, I'll do the welcome and then I'll hand it over to both of you. So welcome to the 2022 International Symposium organized by the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship and Transformative Education. The symposium was organized in collaboration with the Pontifical Universidad Católica de Valparaíso. Forgive me for my potentially bad pronunciation. I will work on it. But we're really appreciative that we had that collaboration. And the theme of our symposium is dialogue and emancipation. So today we are part of a series of 40 different sessions that take place over the course of the week. And you can partake in other sessions via Zoom like we are in this one, but also on Facebook and later on YouTube. So multiple channels to engage in both English, Spanish, and French. And on that note, we are blessed with interpreters who are helping us with this session and providing interpretation into Spanish. So if you look below, you should see an interpretation button. And if you would prefer to listen in Spanish, you can do so thanks to the interpretation that's being provided for us. And thank you to our interpreters. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and we will aim to talk as slow as we can to help with the job that you have. But thank you very much for that. And thank you to everyone for being here today, including our wonderful speakers, for Arrows, Don Jacobs, and also Dalene Swanson. We're pleased to have you both, and it's wonderful to see you again. One other note is that this evening for myself, but it will be at 6 p.m. Valparaiso time, there is a happy hour session. So if you'd like to keep these conversations going, it's an open space for dialogue where presenters as well as audience members, participants can join and have a conversation about the ideas that have been engaged throughout the day. And that's open to the public and free as well. And you can find the link on the website. I'll also try and put the link in the chat towards the end of the session. So with that, I would like to hand it over to perhaps Dalene and then to For Arrows, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And it's my true honor to actually participate in this symposium, especially with For Arrows today. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I think we're going to probably keep it quite informal in most, in every sense of the word, probably. And the last time I think For Arrows and I communicated was almost a decade ago over the book, The Authentic Dissertation, and For Arrows invited me to make a contribution in that book. And basically he wrote from my dissertation into the book, and it was just a lovely, wonderful experience. And so this is the thing about life, these rhizomes, they sort of these filaments, we throw them out into the air and they reconnect when they need to. And we've already had some lovely conversations and shared some interesting thoughts. And I hope these filaments will continue to intersect and join up in the air throughout our lives. So it's my real honor to be in dialogue with For Arrows today. I wanted to just qualify a point. This is about indigeneity in the arts. And an earlier conversation when For Arrows and I were asked to do the symposium together, I remember For Arrows making a comment about they always throw the arts and indigeneity together. And I just wanted to make a comment about that because there is a lot of synergy and there's lots of threads, very important threads. But my intention is not to homogenize and lump the arts and indigeneity together by way of contributing to a hierarchy of knowledges where the sciences and Western science and Western ways of knowing are predominant, and then the arts which are, as we know, in this neoliberal and conservative world, are often marginalized, and therefore they are marginalized together with indigenous thought. So my aim is not to do that, but actually to work against it, and to say that in terms of finding alternative ways of being and knowing, and epistemologies, ethico-onto-epistemologies, alternative ways of being and alternative futures, both the arts and indigeneity, they intersect in many ways, but they also provide pluralistic alternatives to this very dominant and destructive dominant knowledges, like Western sciences. So I just wanted to clarify that before we started, but I actually am going to invite 4 Arrows to make some comments now.
Well, sure. I'll start by bringing in one of those alternatives for our alternative future, and that is, let's bring into our cognitive world the spiritual world, whatever that means to you, from whatever religious or spiritual tradition that you have, or agnostic or atheistic. If there's any sense that you have of there being an energy that can create synchronicity, like the all the things that are floating around that reconnect, then join with me in this Lakota prayer that talks about interconnectedness, which goes across all spiritual traditions, and it talks about remembering who we are. Otunkashila wakantanka nama kompa natatewa topa unshimaka ahitwa yankelo oyate oyasin chanku luto oknamane oichakiapo oyate oyasin unchi wichalapone oichakiapo hecho wichozani washte onyo epictelo tunkashila ihani lako tukashila ihani lako wichozani washte Okichiapi, Okiokipi. Mishante atawa wogilake, matakoye oyasa. So one of I actually looked at the literature just about 10 minutes before I got on to see if there would be any inspirational quote that I could say. But what I really came upon instead was a lot of research. I put in what my search engine was. I said art and health, to see what the Western perspective was on art and health. And it's there, of course. There was research that showed the experience of viewing art was awe-inspiring. And that the awe-inspiring art has a positive effect on the physical and mental bodies. Other research showed that observing art inspires hope and a feeling of fulfillment. There were also some that talked about creating art, because at that point I was thinking, wow, this isn't about observing art, this is about creating art for me from an indigenous perspective. And so, yes, there were some about showing that creative acts have the potential, and what they said in the neuroscience was to reduce stress and depression, alleviate the burden of chronic disease. Now, that's certainly a good thing to know, but for those convinced by neuroscience, I want to tell you that I'm a bit skeptical, and that the outcomes of art that we share in both the dominant worldview and in the indigenous worldview are much greater, but fewer people talk about those that relate to before we had stress and depressions, and before we had chronic disease, right? And so what were the outcomes then? I mean, and why would, I think it's certainly good to focus on that now for even indigenous peoples who are suffering from the oppression and the many ills from living in a prison camp, or, but let's talk about, for 99% of history, all of our ancestors, and how and why art was such a part of our life. And neuroscience doesn't quite do that. For example, Greg Cahetti, probably the foremost indigenous scientist at Tewa, and I wrote a book a while back with a neuroscientist named Zhongmin Li. And the original title was going to be Indigenous Wisdom and Neuroscience. And the same neuroscience that was talking about the health benefits of doing art or watching art or seeing a magnificent art piece. And our title was going to be Indigenous Wisdom and Neuroscience. And we had about 17 doctoral students in the neurosciences give us the state-of-the-art research on some traditional indigenous virtues like generosity, patience, courage, honesty, etc. Thinking that neuroscience would 100% support the emphasis on these ways of being in life that so are expressed, as I will talk about later in our dialogue, with the aesthetics of creative, what we're calling art. Well, but when it came back, when these studies came back, they were saying things like, well, in a study where we were in a lab and we had people playing a Monopoly game, and we had some people, when we tapped them on the shoulder, they were to give their money, their artificial money away to the person on their left. And then we were watching their brains while this happened. And we noticed that when people were giving the money away, a light went on at the same spot where we in previous studies saw selfish acts occurring. And of course, the conclusion of the scientific article from the lens of the non-indigenous worldview was there's no such thing as altruistic generosity. All generosity is ultimately a self-serving act that is a selfish act based on, looking at a light in a little part of our brain, as if that gives us the whole understanding, right? Same thing with deception. One of the conclusions were deception is an important survival mechanism. And Greg and I were going, oh gosh, this is completely not what we are saying, right? So we changed the title of the book to Critical Neurophilosophy and Indigenous Wisdom and published it as that, right? So I think it's important for us to start thinking about a different, maybe not just different, but a more fulfilling understanding of the benefits of engaging in music and dance and the fine arts and all the different ways of going about. And I'll just say a few more words, and then Dalene can talk, and we want to open this up to questions. I guess most importantly, the outcomes that I understand from my time living with a number of cultures that have not lost their language and their traditional ways, which is happening more and more. I have many Navajo students who tell me, well, last year, most of them told me about 70% of their culture have lost the old ways. I talked to a new doctoral student yesterday, and she says more like 85, but it's a sad thing. But what art is about in the traditional understanding, with the languages that emerge from the land described, is it's about a profound sense of place. And since our ultimate conference is about the climate crisis and the biodiversity extinctions and all the things that are happening relative to this ecological system that we are part of, I think that is a real strong reason to look at art, because it really was about a profound sense of place. It was a link between the spiritual energies all around and the person making the tool or creating the utilizable vehicle that became art. Sure, it was also a vehicle for healing certain things, but it was more about maintenance and transmission of place-based cultural knowledge and the cosmology that's common to all the diverse cultures, and it belongs to all of our ancestors and that we're part of. It was a social reality, a way to tell stories, to record histories, to bring the spiritual energy to a tool like a chanupa, a pipe, or a basket, or a knife, or whatever, right? To make an important connection to an animal or a plant, to remind us of our being one of the many creative species that there are, in addition to all those ones that are teachers, right? And so I'll just kind of close with that, but I'll give a quote that I did find that I wrote down that I thought was good. It was from the Apache artist Nancy Marie Miflo, who said in an article entitled "No Word for Art in My Language," which is a real common thing that I've always heard from a number of indigenous. We don't even have a word for art. We do have one for a painting in Lakota, but it's very rarely used. But this is what she says about that. It is clear now that the dynamism and vibrancy of American Indian arts cannot be expressed in the current fine arts vocabulary. In fact, the field of native art production today, and she's talking about now in contemporary times, exceeds our capacity to engage its intellectual parameters productively. Well, I think that's what we all want to do together, because we're all kind of in the same boat of trying to understand that conversation. So I've got a couple stories to tell, but I'll come back to those later. Dalene?
Well, just to follow on from what you were just saying, 4 hours, I'm a critical mathematics educator who was also a professional dancer in the past, and I also write on Ubuntu indigenous philosophy from where I grew up in Southern Africa. So again, Western thinking often compartmentalizes those things, and people think I'm really, really strange and weird because I've got all these interests and all these things that I do. But it depends on the perspective. You can either see them as really closely integrated and very aligned and working in harmony with each other, or you can see them as distinct and being all over the map as an academic, which I've been accused of quite often. But I'm going to follow on from that point that you made about there's no word for art. And I think the same thing is in these Southern African or African indigenous languages, where the distinction between art and, say, even mathematics is just not there. Mathematics was done as part of the lived experience, and it was imbricated into the arts and into daily life. So we often talk about ethnomathematics by way of trying to distinguish those forms of mathematics or mathematics doing from Western styled mathematics. And I think this is part of the problem with science and mathematics. There's this notion that there is this one universal mathematics and there's this one universal science. And that's very, very destructive, because it's not at all. If you go and look at the history of Western mathematics, most of that mathematics was borrowed from African, South American, Asian cultures, and the mathematics, that Western mathematics that we discovered in recent times actually was discovered often thousands of years ago. You just have to look at Pascal's triangle. That was really, it wasn't Pascal who discovered it, and it was used 1,000 years before, you know, he decided, he came upon it. So it's those sorts of things, just in the same way as art is part of the lived expression of life, in the same way the mathematics and science that was done is all part of, and to separate and segment and, you know, categorize these things into different camps is actually part of the violence of Western thought. And so we need to do that. We need to break with those traditions and try to move back to a place where these things are like rhizomes threaded together and part of what makes us whole, what makes us human, that makes us be in the world with a sense of wellness and wellness of being. I actually wanted to just mention Ubuntu because I write a lot on Ubuntu indigenous philosophy, and there's another number of publications. So it's interesting to see how I've even written on decolonizing global citizenship education through Ubuntunizing or indigenizing global citizenship. And I think this is important. And there was a 2015 paper that I wrote about this. But I want to just describe Ubuntu for you from a Southern African perspective. So Ubuntu is short for the isiXhosa proverb in Southern Africa. It comes from the phrase Umuntu, Ngumuntu, Ngabantu. A person is a person through their relationship to others. In other words, we are not human by ourselves as individuals. We only become human through the nature of our relationship with others, how we are with each others in the world. And that we are so caught up in a very individualistic Western mindset that we forget, we think that we are separate expressions of our own humanity as individuals. And Ubuntu would say opposite, that we are not human until we are human with others. And so Ubuntu is recognized as the African philosophy of humanism, or as an ethico-onto epistemology, if you want to use those terms, linking the individual to the collective through brotherhood or sisterhood. It makes a fundamental contribution to indigenous ways of knowing and being, with differing historical emphasis and recontextualization over time and place. It is considered a spiritual way of being in the broader socio-political context of Southern Africa. This approach is not only an expression of a spiritual philosophy in its theological and theoretical sense, but as an expression of the quotidian, of the everyday life. In this sense, it is a way of knowing what fosters a journey towards becoming human, to quote Vanier, or which renders us human, to quote Desmond Tutu, or in its collectivist sense, a greater humanity that transcends alterity of any form. Nobel laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who in the 1995 became the chairman of the post-apartheid South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was a strong advocate of the philosophy and spiritual power of Ubuntu in the recovery of truth through narratives of atrocities from the apartheid era. He also viewed it as necessary in the more important and subsequent processes of forgiveness, reconciliation, transcendence, and healing that arise through the cathartic process of truth-telling. And he was very careful about that point of forgiveness. He said, forgiveness is not just easily given away. It's something that's hard won. And there's certain conditions that need to be met for someone to be forgiven. In this sense, the extension of notions of truth in respect of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's mandate exceeded a forensic notion of truth finding to include three others of truth seeking that encompassed personal and narrative truth, social and dialogic truth, and healing or restorative truth. A sense of African epistemology resounds through these postulations of truth in their formulation and exposition. As a philosophical thread of African epistemology, Ubuntu focuses on human relations, attending to the moral and spiritual consciousnesses of what it means to be human and to be in relationship with another. This is voiced in the TRC's announcement that it shifts the primary focus of crime from the breaking of laws or offenses against a faceless state to a perception of crime as violations against human beings, as injury or wrongdoing to another person. Again, the TRC's imperative of truth-seeking is underscored by a conception of African epistemology and Ubuntu in its incorporation of personal or narrative truth, social or dialogic truth, healing or restorative truth. As I've grown to understand the concept as a lived expression of growing up in South Africa, Ubuntu is born out of the philosophy that community strength comes from community support, and that dignity and identity are achieved through mutualism, empathy, generosity, and community commitment. The adage that it takes a village to raise a child is aligned with the spirit and intent of Ubuntu. But just as apartheid threatened to erode this traditional African way of being, although in some instances it ironically strengthened it through galvanizing collectivist support and creating solidarity amongst the oppressed, so increasingly industrialization, urbanization, globalization threatens to do the same. I'm just going to stop there, but that gives you a little bit of an intro to Ubuntu and this very important Southern African indigenous philosophy.
You know, and I think what's really helpful to hear what you had to say about the Ubuntu is, in my time with the Comcac of Mexico and the Rarumari and the Kogi of Colombia, and I could go on, and in the pockets of our American Indian tribes who still remember it. It's like when you hear them talk, they could be exactly mimicking what you just said. It's the in common. I also work with the Omalawabi people, the Yoruba way of implementing that that idea of Ubuntu, which is essentially, I think it translates as "I am because we are," or something like that. And that's what when we did. I put someone up on an ombleche yesterday, and we picked him. His son and I picked him up this morning on the island. It was a vision quest, and. I reminded him when he walked into the lodge to say "Mitakuye Yasin." That means the same thing as Ubuntu, right? We are all related, all my relations, and this is that key thing. And what it's amazing is how determined our recent adolescent worldview that has been amazing for creating technologies without thinking of the repercussions. But it's amazing that we have such an intention to destroy Ubuntu, to destroy Mitakuye Yasin. And I was at a conference just before the pandemic up at University of British Columbia, speaking to the curriculum department. Curriculum and instruction at the education school. And when I had just written a little book called Sitting Bull's Words for a World in Crisis. And when it was over, someone raised and said, well, do you think if we begin to look at the worldview precepts that our ancestors had and guided us for 99% of human history, and nature, this doesn't belong to anyone, it belongs to people who live in the real world before we were just brick and concrete. And what they learned about how to live. And they said, do you think if we all re-embrace and restore our kinship worldview, that we can turn things around? And for the first time, it just came out of me. I said, no. And you could feel the tension in the room. It was like people went from kind of loving what I was saying to like stark horror about, no hope for the future. And so here we're talking about alternative futures here and the phenomenon of aesthetics. And then right away, a bunch of hands went up, and the first one said, well, then why are you here? And I quoted what you just quoted, Dalene, about 4 times. I said, well, let me just say why I'm here. And I'm going to quote from Sitting Bull. I want to be a human being, right? And so to hear Desmond Tutu and others that are saying this, right? That's what we're not being when we don't recognize our interconnectedness with one another, which we don't recognize because we have moved into an anthropocentric society-based language and mindset about 9,000 years ago. For whatever reasons, it was indigenous people that obviously made the mistake initially, because everybody was indigenous. All of your ancestors are, and we've lost this in common perspective to our great heart. But then I said to them, and I'm not saying it's impossible we can turn things around. I'm just saying that as an activist, I don't have hope that we can. Every time I go outside, I see things worse and worse. And so to me, from a gambling position, I wouldn't gamble on it, right? But the reason I'm still traveling and talking and doing these workshops is because I want you all to understand what I think it means to be a human being. And that means that we are spiritual people, that we're spirits inhabiting a body. And that means that we don't know, it's a mystery. All the words that I've studied in indigenous cultures for what is called God in our dominant worldview is great mysterious thing. It's not even a noun, it's a verb that's great mysterious thing. And so we very rarely mention it. We always go from Wakantanka and then to Tunkashila or Unchimaka, grandmother, grandfather, which are the sort of endearing representations of this great, amazing, creative energy that we call God, that is in the toad and in the grasshopper and in the tree and in the mountain and in the river and in us when we're in our highest way of being, and that's what Sitting Bull said. Smallpox had wiped everybody out more than the COVID-19. The buffalo were all gone. He was being chased. And yet he never stopped doing ceremony. He never stopped doing sun dances. He never stopped writing songs. He never stopped doing all kinds of weaving and things that we would call art in a dominant world. He never stopped being generous. And when he was interviewed in prison, he said just what Dalene was quoting several other luminaries as saying. He says, I got to keep working at being a human being, right? And many of the names of tribes, that's what they are. They simply say, they translate to being a human being. And so how does art as we think of it play into this? I think of music, and because I play piano, I draw horses, but I always do ceremony to burn them afterwards. So, I am teaching my 8-year-old grandson to play, well, let me just tell you one little story, and then I want to hear, Dalene and I want to hear what you are all thinking about in terms of how indigeneity and decolonization, which is, they go together. Decolonization is pre-colonization, right? So there's a lot of rhetoric about decolonizing without understanding what we're going to replace it with. And I want to, I want to show you all the worldview chart that's in most of my books. There's 40 worldview precepts, and we'll look at those if we get a stall in the dialogue, and we can look at those and begin a dialogue. Most contrast between the dominant worldview and the indigenous worldview most contrast between different things in the understanding of worldview have been stopping dialogue. So when worldview was first coined, but in Germany, Wolfenschau, it was about the dialogue, which was not a dialogue, which was a debate between religion and science, right? So it stopped dialogue. But what we're doing with our worldview chart is saying that that the dominant worldview is a binary worldview, an either or worldview, but the indigenous worldview is a non-binary. So then I'm sort of accused of, well, then how can you be having these two contrasting lists of anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism, for example, or high respect for women, women versus low respect for women, or respect for trans-based learning versus kind of ignorance about trans-based learning, all these worldview kinds of things. Well, it's because the goal is to see that as a continuum, as not a good and bad or either or, but as out of balance. And we can look at each one of those and go, wow, I am a little more materialistic than non-materialistic. Therefore, how do I get back into balance? It doesn't mean like one of the worldview precepts is hierarchy, non-hierarchical society versus hierarchical society. Well, the Lakota are a non-hierarchical society, a matrilineal, matriarchal, but during buffalo hunts, we become hierarchical. Somebody becomes a leader, and that person has a hierarchical rank, and for effective, efficient, getting the food back to the community and safety, right? But a different person is nominated the next time, and when they go back to the community, we're non-hierarchical. A lot of people say, well, isn't nature hierarchical? And no, it wasn't Darwin who invented survival of the fittest. It was all the post-Darwinian, neo-Darwinian interpreters. Darwin was looking at one particular long-term adaptation phenomenon, but he, like a following book by Peter Kropotkin, said, no, the earth is based on mutual aid. And it's the aesthetic of art that makes us remember that, and helps us with the history and the connections and the use of a particular tool that will remind us of our connection to the water, to the turtle, to the wind, right? And so going back to the piano with that kind of long digression, I was on stage with Margaret Wheatley the last time I did this, but if there's a piano on stage, I'll use it like this. I'm going to kind of challenge you all to think about how you would respond. I will ask the audience, how many out there play a musical instrument? And of course, in the Western culture, very few will raise their hand. It's usually around 12%. So I'll look at someone who not only didn't raise their hand, but like tried to hide. Okay. And I'll say, so you don't play a musical instrument? No way. I don't even sing in the shower. Okay, would you come on up here? And I'll bring her up, and she'll come nervously, or he will come nervously up to the stage. And then I'll whisper really quickly in their ears, play along with me on this. Then I'll announce to everybody, we're just fooling. Marcia and I, let's call her Marcia. Marcia and I, we go way back. We used to play blues in New Orleans together on the piano. We used to do duets. And I just want to show you how much fun, because one of the things about indigeneity, because that's always what I'm teaching, is it's about bringing joy and light and happiness and feeling into this interconnectedness that we do via art. Because our colors are remind us, what do they remind us of? They don't remind us of buses. They remind us of flowers, right? And so everything about any kind of art is always, if we're conscious of it, a re-embracing of Mother Earth. And so I say, yeah, so we're going to play a song for you. So I'll wheel the piano. And of course, the young lady on stage or the young man is just, nervous as heck, because there's, 100 people in the audience, right? And I'll whisper in her ear, I just want you to play the black notes, but I want you to do it only when I bump your shoulder. And you're gonna play amazing. Oh my God, she'll say, right? And so I'll sit down and I'll start playing a kind of a boogie blues with the left hand. And of course, being in the black notes, for those of you who might know music, that puts you in the same key. So the chances of discordance are much less. And so I'll start telling her a little story, just for her ears only, about what it would be like if we were in New Orleans about 2 a.m. and listened to some blues and da-da-da. And I'll start playing a couple of melody notes, and then I'll bump her. And her hand hits the black notes, sounds okay. She starts going, and I'll encourage her to go more. Pretty soon she's playing with both hands, and I'm following her. The audience roars, standing ovations, right? She's blown away on every level. And so, wow, then of course I get to give my speech, which I want to see if you all know what it is that I say after that, right? One digression that's kind of a fun story is I did this once, and we did a lunch break before I came back and explained what this means. And I heard arguing in the hallway. And it was this woman with her husband, and he was saying, "You never told me you were in New Orleans and you knew how to play the piano, and we've been married for 10 years. And I had to come up and said, rescue her. Yeah. So let's talk about what point was I trying to make, that somebody with no artistic ability in music could come up on stage through this sort of trickery of playing on the black notes, but also the hypnosis of having the confidence to go for it. Because they, about 5% of the time, it just doesn't work. You have to have a sense of music, which most 99% of people do, right? It's just, in a culture that says you've got to be perfect to do it. That's why I live in Mexico. I can go to the DMV and everybody's waiting in line. I'll start singing "Este amor apasionado," and when I get to the volver, to return, the secretaries, the administrators, everybody that's been frustrated waiting in line go, "Y volver." I mean, it's amazing because everybody's half indigenous here, I guess, So anyway, so let's open it up. Is it for folks, for the folks that are listening to all of this that we've talked about indigenous worldview, about the importance of art and the different ways of looking at it. I can call on people if that's.
I'm going to just say that as a dancer, the instrument is my body. And, it's a way of knowing which you cannot express and articulate to anybody else unless you actually do it yourself. And there's a litany of my doctoral students that love telling the story about the fact that when they did research methods courses, I used to dance trees for them. So they still talk about that. And, the whole thing, what does it mean to dance a tree? And I think that's connects with what you're saying.
Oh, it so does. And I love that the reference of our bodies are the instrument, because that's what most of it is, using your hands and your heart and singing. And it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And what was the last thing that you said was that you said something just now that I thought was really, really important. I'll get back to that in a minute. It'll come to me. So who has something to say out there? Oh, I just remember what it was. You were talking about the uniqueness of okay. I want to get the audience into it. You and I could talk forever.
Yes, we could.
I'll jump in if that's okay. I thought there was a really clear connection for arrows between your story and also the challenges that the individualism from Western perspectives has created. So in that individualist viewpoint, there's only a few people or one or two people who are good at playing piano, and only they should play piano, rather than it being this sort of collective, everyone can make music, especially when we do it together. And I thought that was a really powerful connection between the two ideas, that as long as there's someone to bump you and say, you're invited, you can do this too, that you suddenly can play, even though you were convinced that that's not who you were, because you're supposed to be one thing and one thing only. And that is really something that we need to let go of.
And how do you let go of that?
With friends, I hope.
But the friends have the same mindset, right? That's where we get into the worldview, and we kind of get into what I will say. What you said. What the last thing that you said was and you played the trees, remember? And when I won an opportunity with 10 other American Indians to spend 10 days with Carlos Nakai, the great flute player. And our first assignment was to take these flutes that we had never played and go out and play nature. He said, don't do any songs that you know or anything like that. And we had to come back into a group and we had to play. I saw a butterfly land on a tree and a lizard from the tree hit it and it fell in the water or whatever. Or I saw a cloud go by and it started to rain, or the sun was really hot on me. And we would play that. And if you can imagine how terrible it would sound by people that can't play a flute, but you know, not that bad, because you still you hit a note, it sounds good. So you're going, oh, yeah. And then you'd stop embarrassingly. And the other 9 people would say, what kind of sounded to me like for at first you were looking at a butterfly. Holy cow, I can't believe you got that, right? And so I really like to think about that. And that's why if we can use that, that's one way to get beyond that. If all the friends get together and say, let's not worry about what we sound like. We're not Barbara Streisand or Placido Domingo. Let's go out and see if we can do that kind of an experiment together with our bodies, with our dance, with our pantomime, with whatever we do.
But also, if you think about dance, sorry, it's the art form that's the closest to my heart, although I love visual art as well, but it's relational. When we dance, indigenous forms of dance are very much expressive and interpretive of relations with the earth, relations with each other. And, contemporary dance, modern dance, it's about relation. It's about relationships and relations. That's what you're doing with your body. You're expressing those relationships in aesthetic and beautiful ways. And it's forms of knowing and being together in ways that, you wouldn't easily go up to somebody if you were not in a dance form and hug them and bend backwards and, those sorts of things. And yet if you do that in dance, you immediately know what is being expressed. It's you don't need words to express them.
There's also this issue of the repression of self, the censorship in Western culture. So we can, point at Protestant work ethics or Protestant values, Victorianism and all those things, but there's a deeper buttoned downness too, like a seamlessness, and goes back to cogito ergo sum. It's res verba. It's this living as a walking head, almost like as a brain and not a body. And then that was actually reproduced in my generation through rock music, where we'd actually go to concerts and wag our heads, right? So one of the things you mentioned was Mexico, mi querido Mexico, and you said there suddenly it's volver, 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 and we're singing and dancing along, and that's the one strange thing. The Western person is sort of wanting to experience that, and they'll act out actually in very negative ways sometimes in the global South, as we've heard over and over and over. But there's a theory piece here too, and a Cuban theorist, Roberto Fernandez Retamar, and some of the sort of the desire stuff of the Western mind and its need and seeking that spiritual other, like those yoga retreats and all that stuff. I mean, there's an absence and a hunger, and then a total inappropriate power imbalance and some pretty ugly manifestations of some of that stuff.
Absolutely. And I think that theory and practical implementation of it is really the heart of indigeneity. The use of art in ways that do one of those things that I listed, and not art for art's sake. And the theory is that behind it is going to make that ride or not. Who else? How many artists do we have here? Or nobody's gonna see. There you go. There we are. Come on. What do you think of when you think of artists? If you're thinking of, I'm really good at it and I could sell it for $1 million, then we've already stepped down on the wrong path, right? And so, can I share my screen real quick?
Yes, let me know if you have access.
I do. I surely do. Yeah. Okay. Let me just share it real quick to show you how it's the worldview that makes us shrug and hide or whatever, right? That there we go. Try to make it bigger for you. Okay. All right. So again, the preface is really important. Absolutism is discouraged here. We're looking at this non-binary way of understanding how one worldview that is dominant and out of balance is killing us. Another worldview is proven sustainable, and yet one's not good and one's not bad. We are in a continuum. We're all in the same boat. How do we start to look at, well, how did we get so rigid in our hierarchy? How did we get so fear-based? So if you look at the question, how many of you are artists that I just asked, and then just kind of look and see, tell me, I'd like to hear from you. Which ones of those are stemming from the left side? And if you were on the right side more, would there have been yeah, everybody raised their hand. I am an artist, right? Just kind of look at those. I'll kind of fan down slowly. Multifaceted truth would be one. Accepting the mysterious might be. So, I mean, I've never asked this question before, so I don't know the answer, but anybody have any ideas of if you were more on the right side, would you have thought about that after this presentation Dalene and I gave? Would you have thought about, yeah, I'm an artist, if that's, would you, what things on the right side, because they're all interrelated. You can't really just choose one, but still, choose one, anybody?
So 4 arrows, what I'd like to mention, what you're making me think about is just kind of the difference between process and product. And in education, there's so much that focuses on product, and it's really about process, but also the arts and everything you both are talking about the relationalness of life is really resonating with me.
Absolutely. And if we're in that process, yeah, I'm an artist. I can even raise my hand with my horses that I do and burn, right? I'm a horse artist, right? And yeah, so that's one. And that that's the number 14. Flexible boundaries and interconnected systems are required for that, right? Number 13, truth is multifaceted and accepting the mysterious. Right.
But 4 arrows, you can also teach mathematics through the arts. I do, by way of decolonizing the sciences and mathematics. The arts are very powerful ways of knowing and being that can be used instead of repulsing the sciences or mathematics, imbricating, bringing in the arts as a form of expression, as a way of knowing, by way of, coming to know mathematics or science is also a possibility. It's, it does work. I mean, you can teach science and mathematics through the arts.
Absolutely. My daughter does it in Los Angeles. She has a school and she's a mathematician, and that's exactly what she does. And my 17-year-old grandson is now a freshman at Stanford, and my 22-year-old graduated from UC Berkeley at age 16, and they both dropped out of school when they were like 10 years old and got into her program. So, and it's really all about arts-based, like we did in our book, The Authentic Dissertation.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's why I selected you for one of the people. I got 245 responses, Dalene, and Yours was one of 27 I chose.
Oh, well, I'm tremendously honored for ours. You see where it's led us to. Wonderful. Right. Well, that point about the intolerance of injustice as well as being on your right-hand side column, and that's quite an interesting concept as well. I used to be the director of what was called here in Scotland as the Access to Degree Studies. So it's widening participation. We can critique that term, but there are people that have, for whatever reason, not finished school, and that otherwise would never have an opportunity to get into university, and they come and do this one-year course with us. And you know, the most effective way of getting people that have been disaffected from school and from education back into education is the critical engagement. It's about that justice orientated, and they get fired up, and when they start to think that university could be about that it isn't the ongoing forms of oppression and subjugation that they experienced at school, you know, that's when they really actually properly engage, and you won't believe the quality of the work that comes from people that were treated as if they were stupid, they were never going to be able to ever study further. It's just the most unbelievable experience. It really gets me up in the morning. I've moved institutions, but that's still part of my heart, and it won't ever go away, ever. Just that the way in which the critical and the justice oriented is aligned with that, you know, the artistic, the way of being in the world that is other than this more destructive, death-like form of existence.
Well, that death-like form of existence is what was just in the chat box. The kids go into school being able to draw a dinosaur and coming out, well, I can't do that. You know, on Pine Ridge, the reservation where I was Dean of Education, I went to a classroom one time, I'll never forget, and there was a Nebraska non-Indian teacher who didn't like the Lakota kids teaching them, and they were being asked to read. And, you know, the brown, you know, and which, and somebody happened to mention an animal. And I think it was a weasel. And someone said the weasel was brown, you know, that was all it was, right? And someone right this spontaneously, they were like 9-year-old or 7-year-olds, what's a weasel? And then right away, another very proud person that was, you know, an Indian Lakota girl. Oh, I know what a weasel is. I saw one. One came into our hen house. And a dialogue of enthusiasm began about weasels and life and what. And what did the teacher do? Hey, this is a reading lesson. Stop this. Stop this talking. Read the next sentence. Oh my gosh, that's exactly that was exactly the end of drawing dinosaurs. So thank you for that note. And that's the same with music. It's the same with music. Someone was forced to play it in a way that was, I mean, that's a complex topic. You know, my daughter, I never forced her to play music, and she said, Dad, I wish you would have, right? Because there's certain things children don't know that they don't know, right? But that's in our current environment, in an environment where everything is open and there are role models, then there is no need for force, right? But still, it goes back to that. We are losing a life expressing joy because of a system of this kind of education and this kind of educational oppression, right? So now let me ask again. I'm looking at everybody. I'm kind of looking at Natalie and Andrea. And I'm looking at, so raise your hand if you are an artist. That's what I wanted to see. That's what I wanted to see. Now you keep saying it. And remember, art and trance go together, right? Right. And that's another thing that we don't do much of, is really understand the phenomenon of hypnosis, the phenomenon of trance-based learning. That's TRANCE, trance. I did a presentation not long ago, and the interpretation of that came out to be train, I think. But the trance-based learning, it's why we're in the mess we're in. How can you explain that intelligent people who can go to the moon with a machine are polluting every life system on the planet, if it's not because we are hypnotized into a way of thinking during the 5 years of early childhood, mostly, when we're all in states of hypnosis, being raised by people who are working and doing this and that and don't know that what they're saying is hypnotizing the child, but also during times of stress. All creatures become hypersuggestible to the communication of a perceived trusted authority figure. I learned that from wild horses. Go on YouTube and put in the horse hypnotist, and you'll see me when I had hair with a wild horse. So this idea of trance and how music and art of all forms, dancing especially, Dalene, puts us into an alternative brainwave frequency that makes us hypersuggestible to our own imagined ideas. It makes the world a better place if you draw a picture of a blue lake. I don't care if it's in between the lines or not. Water goes out of the circle all the time, right? That's actually a trance-based phenomenon. If we can learn to kind of see it that way and then connect it with helping the world, then it becomes ceremony. See, indigenous people didn't know about hypnosis. They knew about, quote, what we're calling art as part of ceremony. And ceremony is same thing as hypnosis. I taught hypnosis at UC Berkeley, so I can say this stuff, right? Hypnosis is believing in an image deeply when you're in a lower brainwave frequency. So, and that image comes from an intentional, predetermined from the therapist or you, right? But you don't really need a therapist if you know what you want to imagine. And so the ceremony is really knowing that, wow, we can't do this with just willful determination alone. We can't be a better hunter. We can't find more berries. We can't be more generous. We can't, unless we have a ceremony to give thanks and to do this and to try this or whatever, right? So keep that in mind as we come upon the end of the hour.
Four arrows and Dalene, many thanks. It's one of what I wanted to just quickly share in the theme of arts, that I've been doing poetry for some time. And of course, the best advice I received is not to quit my day job. No one's going to become a millionaire or a billionaire doing poetry, maybe so. But I wanted to say that I've written a few books with Cuban poets, and I've been to Cuba many times, and I was involved in solidarity with Cubans. But there was one event that we had that was so transformative to me. With the Cuban poets, we went into the center of Holguin in eastern Cuba. It was around midnight in the center of town, and there was some jazz music, there was some rum, and there was about 80 people, chairs, and we had a few small lights, and we were reading the poetry, and it really hit me that this is wonderful. It was beautiful, and there's words, there's poems, and my travels in Latin America, I think poetry is more valued. I'll generalize, but I think we need more poetry as a way of softening all of the edges and everything that's out there. And we need to bring it back for people's imagination. So many thanks for all the work here.
Well, I used to always say when I grow up, I want to be a poet, until I really learned that we are all already poets. And let me close with a flute song, if I may. And you can just fade off and turn off the thing at any time, like we're a movie. But this is a song that the Cherokee mothers sang to their children, or if they had been killed or died, a woman replaced them to sing to the children on the Trail of Tears. So much worse situation than we're maybe in now in some ways. And the song words were, but did you see the beautiful animals in the clouds? Did you see the beautiful colors of the trout when we crossed the brook? Did you see the grasses dancing in the breeze? Did you hear the beautiful sounds? In other words, the song is about remembering the beauty in the world. So I can't think of a better way to end an art thing. And thanks to everybody. Here's the thing, and I'll just sign off.
Thank you, Forrest. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you so much to both of you. Any final words, Dalene? Thank you, Four Arrows, for that wonderful closing.
Just that this was